The quiet archivist had never been the kind of man who drew attention in a crowded room. He was the shadow in the corner of the grand university library, a figure people overlooked as they hurried past him to consult the works of professors, scholars, and archaeologists. Yet on this particular afternoon, when he timidly spoke up during a seminar, every eye turned toward him not in respect, but in ridicule. "The manuscript you're analyzing," he said softly, clutching his notes to his chest. "It's incomplete, but I believe there's a coded message hidden in the margins, something the scribes never meant to be obvious." The room erupted with stifled chuckles. A graduate student snorted, whispering something cruel to her neighbor. But the harshest blow came from Professor Halverson, the towering, self-assured Mayanist whose reputation filled entire conference halls. He leaned back, folded his arms, and smirked. "A coded message?" the professor repeated, savoring each syllable as though it were a joke. "My dear boy, if you want to play treasure hunter, I suggest you join an adventure club. We are serious scholars here." The archivist, Mateo Alvarez, felt the sting of humiliation burn his cheeks. He lowered his eyes, nodding quickly, as though to retract the statement, but deep down, something inside him refused to die so easily. He had spent years quietly cataloging manuscripts, noting patterns that others dismissed as ink blemishes or scribal errors. To him, these irregularities whispered secrets. And the one manuscript on the table, now a brittle Mayan codex fragment rescued from a fire decades earlier, screamed louder than any he had ever seen. He sat silently for the remainder of the seminar, his mind a storm of indignation and determination. They thought him foolish, insignificant, a mere librarian with too much imagination. But what they didn't know, what they could never guess, was that he carried within him a hidden inheritance. As the students filed out, Mateo lingered, his hand brushing across the fragile parchment. The worn glyphs shimmered faintly under the afternoon light. And then, almost imperceptibly, his grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "The ancients hid their truths in plain sight, Mateo. Never believe what the world says is meaningless. The patterns hold the key." His grandfather, a farmer with no formal education, had once stumbled upon a stone carving in the Guatemalan jungle when Mateo was a child. Though the discovery was dismissed and later forgotten, Mateo had never forgotten the intensity in the old man's eyes as he told stories of hidden temples and lost knowledge buried beneath vines and earth. Mateo had grown up carrying those stories in silence, nurturing a fascination others mocked. Now, as he stood before the manuscript, he saw not just faded ink, but the echo of that legacy. That night, long after the lights of the seminar hall had gone dark, Mateo returned to the library. He moved quietly, his steps deliberate, as if afraid the walls themselves might betray him. The manuscript lay under glass, but he had keys archivists always did. He eased it out carefully, his hands gloved, and placed it beneath a magnifying lamp. The margins glowed faintly under the harsh light, revealing smudges that didn't align with the main text. They curved, intersected, repeated, not random at all. His pulse quickened. He jotted down the shapes in his notebook, the way a detective might copy the strokes of a hidden cipher. "Laugh all you want, Professor," Mateo whispered under his breath. "But if I'm right, history won't remember your smirk. It will remember this night." He felt the thrill of discovery surge through him, a quiet fire that no ridicule could extinguish. He knew the path ahead would be long and fraught with doubt, but the first step had been taken. Somewhere in those fragile pages, he believed, lay the key to something the world had forgotten, a hidden truth, a buried secret, maybe even the ruins his grandfather once dreamed of. And as Mateo closed the manuscript, sliding it gently back into place, he allowed himself one fleeting smile. He was no longer just the quiet archivist. He was a man holding the thread to unravel a mystery that could change everything. If you're enjoying this story of justice and hidden strength, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of prejudice turned into the most valuable lesson of Professor Halverson's life. The next revelation was waiting, and Mateo could feel it pulsing beneath his fingertips. The library was silent, except for the faint hum of the lamps. Mateo sat hunched over the manuscript, his pen scratching furiously across his notebook. Hours had passed unnoticed. The world outside might as well have ceased to exist. The archivist's mind was consumed by the strange marks along the parchment's edges. They were not ink stains. They were deliberate strokes, faint, fragmented, and arranged like a puzzle, waiting for the right pair of eyes. Mateo adjusted the lamp and leaned closer. Under the glare, certain spots of ink gleamed in a way that ordinary text did not. He gently turned the page, and there it was again, faint symbols hidden between lines of ceremonial glyphs, like whispers concealed beneath a song. His heart pounded. For years he had suspected scribes sometimes layered secrets into their manuscripts, but this was the first time he had actual proof staring back at him. "Why didn't anyone else see this?" he murmured. His voice, low and unsteady, sounded almost foreign in the cavernous library. Perhaps they had seen it, he thought bitterly. Perhaps the professors and experts had noticed, but chosen to dismiss it because it didn't fit their theories. Mateo knew the disdain all too well, the sideways glances, the patronizing smiles. They saw him as a custodian of books, not a seeker of knowledge. But tonight, the manuscript revealed itself to him, not to them. A sudden draft rustled the pages. Mateo looked up sharply. The reading room was empty, but the sound awakened a memory. He was 12 again, sitting in his grandfather's small hut. The old man leaned close, whispering about the hidden messages of the ancients, about how Mayan scribes carved double meanings into their words. They wrote for the ruler's eyes, his grandfather had said, but they also wrote for those who could see beyond. Mateo clenched his jaw. Maybe others dismissed these faint marks because they lacked the patience or the belief. He, however, had both. He pulled out a vial of lemon water and a brush, an archivist's quiet trick for revealing faded ink. With trembling precision, he dabbed it along the margin of one page. The faint marks darkened, connecting like strands of a spider's web. His breath caught. The strokes formed a pattern, triangles intersecting at precise angles. They were not random symbols, but coordinates. Coordinates to what? His mind raced. A temple? A tomb? Could this truly be a map concealed within ritual texts? A wave of exhilaration mixed with fear swept through him. The very air felt charged. He scribbled the shapes into his notebook, comparing them with ancient Mayan star charts he had memorized. Slowly, painfully, the pieces aligned. The marks pointed to a cluster of stars revered in Mayan mythology, but when adjusted for terrestrial alignment, they suggested something far more shocking, a location deep within the Guatemalan jungle. Mateo pushed back from the desk, his pulse hammering. If he was right, this manuscript didn't just preserve prayers or rituals. It concealed directions, a coded message meant to endure across centuries. A path hidden in plain sight. Yet even as triumph surged within him, doubt gnawed at the edges. What if I am mistaken? What if this is just wishful thinking, born of loneliness? He closed his eyes, and in the silence, Professor Halverson's mocking laughter returned to him. "Join an adventure club," the professor had sneered. Mateo's fists tightened. Number. He knew what he saw. He had spent his life in these archives, studying the faintest details others ignored. His grandfather's voice guided him still. If he walked away now, he would be no better than the skeptics who mocked him. He bent back over the manuscript. This time, with each line he traced, a strange feeling grew inside him, as though unseen eyes were watching, as though the ancients themselves had been waiting for someone to finally listen. The quiet archivist was no longer only preserving history. He was unraveling a secret it had fought to keep hidden. Mateo left the library that night, with his notebook clutched so tightly his knuckles turned white. The city streets were hushed, but in his mind, ancient drums beat louder than the traffic. He barely noticed the cold air nipping at his skin as his thoughts spiraled back to a face from long ago, his grandfather's class. The old man had been a simple farmer, weathered by sun and soil, but his eyes had always carried an untamed fire. Mateo could still see the way he leaned over the kitchen table, tracing shapes in the dust with his calloused finger. The jungle has secrets, Niño. Secrets that hide not in what is shown, but in what is missing. The ancients were clever, they spoke to us without words. Mateo hadn't understood then. He was just a boy, staring wide-eyed at stories that sounded like fables. His grandfather had once taken him into the forest to show him a crumbling stone half buried by roots. The villagers mocked him for it, calling him a dreamer, chasing shadows. But the conviction in his voice that day had etched itself into Mateo's heart. One day, someone will listen to these stones, the old man had said, and when they do, the world will remember. Now, decades later, the manuscript had awakened that memory with startling clarity. The same symbols his grandfather drew in the dirt appeared in the margins of the codex, triangles, aligned like the constellations he spoke of. Mateo's chest tightened. Was it possible the old man had glimpsed a fragment of the truth all those years ago? He sat at his desk in his small apartment, spreading his notes across the surface. His hands trembled as he sketched the coordinates again, adjusting the angles just as his grandfather once adjusted imaginary stars in the sky. The lines intersected with unnerving precision. Deep jungle, remote, almost unreachable. Mateo leaned back, his heart racing. He whispered aloud, as though speaking to the memory of his grandfather. "It's real, abuelo. You were right. They laughed at you, just as they laugh at me. But you were right." For a moment, emotion overwhelmed him. His eyes stung, but whether from fatigue or tears, he couldn't tell. He imagined his grandfather smiling, nodding with quiet pride. That image alone steadied him. But alongside the swell of determination came fear. If the coordinates led to what he suspected, he was holding a truth powerful enough to rewrite history. And truth, he knew, had a way of attracting danger. Already, he pictured Professor Halverson sneering at him in front of the seminar, dismissing him as a dreamer. If Halverson ever suspected what Mateo had uncovered, he would take the discovery for himself, claim it, publish it, bury Mateo's name under his shadow. The archivist clenched his jaw. No, this was not Halverson's to take. This was his grandfather's legacy, and by extension, his own. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. Mateo lit a small candle, though he didn't need it. The flame was for his grandfather. "You always said the ancients wrote for those who could see beyond," he whispered. "I'll prove you right." He stared at the growing map in his notes, the lines converging on a place the modern world had forgotten. Deep jungle, unmarked by tourist maps or archaeologist surveys. A place spoken of only in whispers. And as the candle flickered low, Mateo realized something startling. He was no longer searching for recognition from the professors who mocked him. He was searching to fulfill a promise made long ago in a dusty hut, when a boy listened to an old man dream of secrets waiting to be found. The manuscript was no longer just parchment and ink. It was a bridge between his past and the ancients, and it was calling him forward. The next morning, Mateo returned to the university, his notebook tucked under his arm like contraband. The library hallways bustled with students carrying stacks of books and laptops, but to Mateo, it all felt distant, muffled, as though he were walking underwater. His eyes darted toward the seminar room. Professor Halverson was already inside, surrounded by an eager group of graduate students, his deep laugh echoing like a booming gavel of authority. Mateo hesitated in the doorway, the weight of last night's discovery pressing against his ribs. He knew what would happen if he spoke. He knew the sneers, the dismissals, the biting remarks meant to put him back in his place, yet the thought of staying silent gnawed at him even more. Gathering his courage, he stepped forward. "Professor," he began, voice steady but low. Halverson glanced up with barely disguised annoyance. "Yes, Alvarez? Another late-night fantasy about scribal secrets?" The students laughed, their eyes lighting up with cruel delight. Mateo swallowed hard. "The manuscript, I believe it conceals coordinates. I can prove it." The laughter doubled, bouncing off the walls like cruel echoes. A student whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Next, he'll say, "It's a treasure map." But Halverson did not laugh. Instead, he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with the cold sharpness of a blade. "Coordinates?" he repeated, his tone dripping with mockery. "My dear archivist, you must have mistaken coffee stains for cartography. Ancient manuscripts are ritual texts, not your playground for imaginary adventures." Mateo's pulse hammered in his ears. "I've seen the patterns. They align with Mayan star constellations. Adjusted for the terrain, they point to nothing," Halverson cut in, slamming his palm against the desk. "To nothing but your desperation to be relevant." The room fell silent at the sudden violence of his tone. Even the students shrank back, their smirks fading. Halverson stood, towering over Mateo, his voice like thunder. "You are an archivist, not a scholar. Know your place. If you wish to daydream, do it in private. Do not pollute serious study with childish fantasies." Mateo felt the weight of every word crush against him. But beneath the humiliation, a flicker of anger burned. He remembered his grandfather's laughter, rich and unashamed, even when villagers mocked him. He remembered the shimmering patterns in the manuscript that no amount of scorn could erase. He lowered his eyes, not in defeat but in defiance, concealing the fire in his chest. "Maybe you're right, Professor," he said softly. "Maybe it is just fantasy." Then he turned and walked out, his notebook still pressed tightly to his chest. Behind him, the murmurs began again, but Halverson's glare followed him out the door, suspicion gleaming faintly in his eyes. For all his arrogance, Halverson had caught something in Mateo's tone, something unshaken. Outside, Mateo inhaled deeply, the air cool against his burning face. Humiliation was nothing new to him, but today it carried a sharper edge. He realized Halverson would never believe him. No one here would. If the coordinates meant anything, he could not rely on academia to validate them. This was his burden and his opportunity. As he walked across the courtyard, Mateo's thoughts hardened into resolve. He could no longer remain the quiet archivist, waiting for recognition. If the manuscript truly pointed to something in the jungle, then he would have to go there himself, alone, if necessary. His grandfather's voice returned to him like a drumbeat in the distance. "One day, someone will listen to these stones. And when they do, the world will remember." Mateo clenched his fists. He had been mocked, dismissed, and humiliated. But he was not broken. The professor's scorn had only pushed him closer to the edge of a decision he already knew he had to make. He would follow the code. He would follow it into the wild, no matter the cost. The room was dark, except for the halo of light spilling over Mateo's desk. His apartment smelled faintly of dust and ink, the scent of nights spent hunched over books no one else cared to read. But tonight, his table was not cluttered with random manuscripts. Tonight, it held a single sacred object, the notebook in which he had copied the faint, coded marks. He ran his finger along the inked triangles and lines he had traced with meticulous care. They were no longer merely strange smudges to him. They were doors, each stroke a lock waiting for the right key. Mateo had lived too long in shadows to miss the meaning hidden in them. A fresh determination pulsed through him. He began transcribing the marks into digital form, overlaying them onto topographical maps of Guatemala he had downloaded. With every adjustment, every recalibration, the shapes grew clearer. He was not chasing a ghost. He was following deliberate instructions, steps left centuries ago, by scribes who must have known their world would someday vanish into jungle and silence. But even with his growing certainty, doubt crept in. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and allowed his thoughts to whisper their cruelest fears. What if Halverson was right? What if this is desperation, not discovery? What if I have fooled myself with patterns where none exist? His chest tightened. The professor's sneering voice slithered back into his memory. "You are an archivist, not a scholar. Know your place." Mateo opened his eyes sharply and slammed the notebook shut. His breath came in ragged bursts. No, he would not let Halverson's words become prophecy. He had seen what others refused to see. He had dedicated his life to details everyone else dismissed. That was his strength. That was his curse. His eyes shifted toward the shelf, where his grandfather's old belongings rested. A worn leather satchel, a chipped compass, and a small carved figurine of a jaguar. Mateo rose and held the figurine in his palm. "You told me the jungle keeps its secrets," he whispered. "But I think it wants to be found." He sat again, opening the notebook. This time, he worked with relentless focus. Line by line, he decoded the symbols, cross-referencing Mayan constellations with geographic terrain. Slowly, the shape of a path emerged. It was not just coordinates, it was a route. Hidden rivers, mountain ridges, and dense valleys had been accounted for, as though the scribes themselves had walked the path and inscribed it into their manuscript. At last, his pen stopped. Mateo stared at the final map that had taken shape beneath his trembling hand. It pointed to a remote region of jungle near the borders of Belize and Guatemala, far from known excavation sites. His heart thundered in his chest. He whispered the words aloud. "A hidden pyramid." The sound of it filled the room, heavy with awe and dread. For a long while, he sat frozen. To act on this discovery meant leaving behind the life he knew, the safety of anonymity, the shadow of ridicule. It meant risking everything, even his life, in a place where jaguars and fever claimed men without warning. Yet, as he traced the lines one more time, he felt a surge of clarity. He could not go. This was more than curiosity now. It was destiny. Mateo set the pen down, his hand steady for the first time. He rose and pulled his grandfather's satchel from the shelf, brushing off years of dust. Inside, the compass still glinted faintly under the lamplight. He slipped it into his pocket, then folded the notebook carefully into the bag. Tomorrow, he would begin preparations. He would leave behind the library, the sneers, the dismissals. He would follow the manuscript's call into the jungle itself. And if the world mocked him once more, so be it. For the first time in his life, Mateo Alvarez felt certain that history had chosen him. The jungle greeted him like a wall of heat and sound. The air was thick with humidity, every breath dragging the weight of water into his lungs. Cicadas screamed from unseen branches, and somewhere in the distance, a low growl reminded him that he was trespassing in a world that did not belong to men. Mateo adjusted the strap of his grandfather's satchel and pressed forward. The path was no path at all, just an uneven tangle of roots, vines, and shadows. He had hired a small boat to take him upriver and slipped away under the pretense of personal research, knowing full well no university would ever sponsor this journey. Now he was alone, save for the memory of the manuscript's code guiding his steps. Each night, he unrolled his notebook under the flickering glow of a lantern. The jagged lines of coordinates merged with the maps he sketched from his compass readings. Slowly, the forest gave way to patterns that mirrored the manuscript's instructions. At times, when exhaustion threatened to break him, he could almost hear his grandfather's voice urging him forward. "The stones, remember, Niño. Follow them, and they will show you." But the jungle did not welcome him easily. On the third day, he slipped crossing a slick rock and tore the skin on his palms raw. On the fifth, his food supplies ran low, and he survived on bitter roots and rainwater collected in his canteen. At night, the sounds of predators prowling just beyond the glow of his fire gnawed at his nerves. And yet, with every hardship, something within Mateo hardened. The quiet archivist who once bowed his head in the seminar room now stood taller, each obstacle a silent testament that he was no longer a man bound by ridicule, he was a man walking toward destiny. On the seventh morning, the forest canopy parted just enough for sunlight to pierce through in golden shafts. Mateo paused, blinking against the glare, and raised his compass. The arrow aligned perfectly with the last set of coordinates he had deciphered. His pulse quickened. He trudged onward, heart pounding louder with every step. The manuscript had spoken of rivers and stars, of triangles marking sacred space. Now, as he pushed through a dense wall of vines, he stumbled into a clearing. Before him, 3 jagged stones jutted from the earth, perfectly aligned with the rising sun. Mateo fell to his knees, trembling. They were markers just as the code had described. Ancient, weathered, half swallowed by roots, but unmistakable. He touched the stones with reverence, his fingers tracing the worn glyphs carved into them. A sob broke from his throat. For a moment, the archivist's mind reeled with the enormity of what this meant. His grandfather had not been a fool. The villagers, the professors, the sneering students, they had all been blind. But here, in this hidden place, Mateo felt the weight of truth pressing against him like the hand of history itself. That night, he built a small fire near the stones. His body ached, his clothes clung to him with sweat, and his stomach growled with hunger. But his spirit burned brighter than it ever had. He sat with his notebook open, staring at the final lines of the code. They pointed beyond this clearing, deeper still, where the forest grew darker and less forgiving. As the fire crackled, Mateo whispered into the flames, "I will find it. I will show them all." The jungle listened in silence. And somewhere beyond the trees, where roots coiled around secrets centuries old, something waited for him, patient, hidden, eternal. The air grew heavier, the deeper Mateo pushed into the jungle. It clung to him like a living thing, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. His boots sank into the mud, each step a battle against exhaustion, but the fire in his chest would not let him stop. Every broken branch, every stone etched with half-faded glyphs, felt like a whisper guiding him toward something vast, something monumental. On the 12th morning, after hours of hacking through vines that seemed to regenerate as quickly as he cut them, Mateo stumbled. His foot struck stone. He froze, heart hammering. Carefully, he brushed the moss away, revealing a carved step. Not just a stone, a stair. His breath caught. He clawed at the vines, tearing them away with trembling hands. More steps emerged, rising from the ground like the bones of a giant awakening from centuries of sleep. He staggered backward, his vision blurring with disbelief. A pyramid. Not the massive stone giants that tourists posed beside, but one hidden and untouched, veiled by jungle and silence. Its sides were swallowed by roots thicker than a man's body, its peak lost in the canopy above. But there it was, undeniable, immovable, real. Mateo dropped to his knees, tears spilling down his cheeks. "Abuelo," he whispered, voice cracking. "You were right. You were always right." He pressed his forehead against the cold stone, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. For years he had been the shadow in the seminar room, the man no one listened to, the archivist mocked for daring to dream. But here, kneeling before an untouched Mayan pyramid, he was no longer invisible. History itself had spoken through him. Yet joy was quickly tempered by awe, even fear. The pyramid exuded a power that made his skin prickle. It was as if the structure had been waiting, patient, watching the centuries crawl by until the right set of eyes arrived. Mateo felt small before it, insignificant against its silence. He forced himself to stand, his legs unsteady. He circled the base slowly, brushing aside vines, tracing glyphs with reverent fingers. The carvings told stories of kings, of sacrifices, of gods whose names still stirred unease. But interwoven among them, Mateo saw the same triangular symbols that had filled the manuscript's margins. This was the end of the code, the destination. As the sun sank low, Mateo sat at the foot of the stairs, his body weak, but his spirit alight. He imagined Halverson's smug face dissolving into shock as news of this discovery spread across the world. He imagined the students who had laughed, falling silent, unable to look him in the eye. But more than that, he imagined his grandfather's name carried on scholars' tongues, no longer a forgotten farmer's tale, but a truth vindicated by stone and vine. A cool wind swept through the clearing, rustling the leaves like whispers from the past. Mateo looked up at the towering structure and felt a shiver. This was not just stone. This was legacy. This was justice. And as night fell, stars glittered above the canopy, aligning with the very constellations his grandfather once traced in the dirt. Mateo understood then. The pyramid had never been lost. It had only been waiting for him to come. Months later, the jungle was quiet again, the vines reclaiming their hold on the ancient stones. But far away, in lecture halls and newsrooms across the world, Mateo Alvarez's name was no longer whispered as a footnote. It was spoken with reverence, surprise, and a hint of disbelief. The headlines had blared. Unknown archivist discovers hidden Mayan pyramid. Quiet librarian rewrites history. Photographs of the pyramid's moss-covered steps appeared in magazines. Documentaries rushed into production, and universities scrambled to claim some connection to the man they once ignored. Mateo, however, did not bask in the spotlight. He rarely granted interviews, and when he did, his answers were brief, careful, humble. The archivist who once sat invisible in the back of seminar rooms seemed uninterested in fame. Instead, he carried himself with the same quiet dignity he always had, though now the world finally saw him. Professor Halverson, on the other hand, found himself at the center of a storm. His mocking dismissal of Mateo had not been forgotten. Students shared clips and transcripts of his scornful words online, branding him the symbol of arrogance brought low by truth. Once the towering authority in Mayan studies, he now avoided questions. His reputation cracked beyond repair. At faculty gatherings, colleagues offered him polite smiles but avoided his gaze, as though his downfall were contagious. Mateo never gloated. When asked about Halverson, he would only say, "He taught me something important, that silence can be stronger than ridicule, if you wait long enough." Privately, however, Mateo thought often of the moment he had touched the pyramid stones. That memory was etched deeper than any praise, stronger than any humiliation. He remembered kneeling in the clearing, whispering his grandfather's name, and feeling as though the entire forest had leaned in to listen. That was the true triumph, not the headlines, not the accolades, but the vindication of a man whose dreams had once been dismissed as fantasy. Weeks after the discovery, Mateo returned to the village where his grandfather had lived and died. Children ran barefoot through the dusty streets, their laughter echoing off clay walls. He walked to the hut, still standing though weathered with age, and placed a photograph of the pyramid on the table where his grandfather once told stories. "You were right, abuelo," he whispered. "They will remember." He stayed there a long while, listening to the wind. For the first time in years, his heart felt at peace. He no longer sought approval from professors or validation from skeptics. He had fulfilled a promise, not only to himself, but to the man who had first taught him to see what others ignored. The pyramid would stand for centuries more, silent but undeniable, a monument not only to the Mayans who built it, but also to the quiet archivist who refused to be silenced. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all, that arrogance blinds, but humility sees, that the voices we dismiss as insignificant often carry the truths that change the world. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.